language and data. So I lead a research group called Data Science Law Lab, and the huge focus of our work is on data and data access, and broadly knowledge governance. So my research focus and interest has always been in the copyright, intellectual property, knowledge governance broadly described. And copyright is really about the expression of ideas. And when you talk about knowledge governance, it's about language, because language is the medium with which you share knowledge. So if you don't speak, then we don't know what you know. And if you want us to know what you know, you're going to speak or communicate in one language or the other. So thinking about law and policy as a focus of my work and how that relates to this project that is being launched today, you start to think about how does law and how does policy enable or restrict some of these things from happening or from taking place. So if, for example, in the University of Pretoria, if we did not have a policy that says that intellectual property in theses and dissertations belong to the university, we would then have to go and meet each of the students whose theses and dissertations are being translated to request their permission to do so. Mm-hmm. So you have to then walk back and think about how do we create policies that enable some of these things to happen, and how do we ensure that the policies that we have will not stop some of these developments from happening. Stop here. Let's stop more.
You are going to talk more, because that leads us into what you said leads us very nicely into the question that I had, because there's the question of policy reform. So there are policies that enable this, but there may also be policies that present obstacles to the development of multilingualism in the way that we described it here. So maybe talk a little bit about some of those challenges.
Now that I have the so there's law, there's policy, then there's government in between as the let me say the executive arm of government, particularly, who has constitutionally the responsibility of executing the law that we have in place. And then think about copyright law. It's a controversial topic in this country at the moment, because the Copyright Amendment Bill has been dragged and dragged and dragged and dragged. And one of the things with the Copyright Amendment Bill is this whole idea of knowledge governance. This whole idea of what I would say from my research has been about equity. Right. So we are going to, for example, we're going to be doing this project, we're going to be launching it. And Bukosi can tell you for free that there's a lot of trying to do work behind the scenes, trying to navigate these policies and looking at how do you respond to data access issues. Now, when you have the work that will go into creating these data sets that will come from this translation, you then have to start thinking about the whole concept of equitable, knowledge governance, equitable knowledge sharing. So what do we have to receive in return for all the work that we've put in? And so you're looking at copyright law specifically, you think about the fact that if you are all out for protectionism, where you say, UP has put in all this work, it should own copyright in the work, it should decide who has access and who doesn't have access. If we do that, then we won't be able to do what Prof has said about having the open infrastructure where UP knows what Forte is doing, Forte knows what UP is doing, because everyone is contributing, because you gain more when you contribute. If you don't have laws and policies that sort of provide a governance framework for that kind of access to happen, and for it to be equitable, and for it to come from a place of cognizance of what each person or each institution has put forward towards creating whatever it is that they are putting forward, then you're going to have a problem. Because now you have something that ideally should be open and accessible to everyone, but you don't want to run into a situation where you are not addressing the question of open for who. So every time we talk about, knowledge governance, every time we talk about openness in terms of sharing knowledge, we must also then ask ourselves, open for who? Because when you answer that question of open for who, then you're going to be able to say, if it's open for me and I don't have the access to infrastructure that allows me to make meaningful use of that open access that I have, then I'm worse off than the person who has, greater access to those things. So, to round off so that even though I want to still take, but think about this work now and think about the infrastructure that is needed to take these data sets to the next level. And then ask yourself, what infrastructure do we have in this country, in the continent of Africa, to then take these data sets and turn it into tools that help us, tools that address our context. And think about big tech and the massive amount of funds and infrastructure and compute and things that they have to make meaningful use of those things. If we then make it open without having parameters around what is each person who is accessing this open infrastructure bringing to the table, or beyond everybody just having access, then we're going to run into a situation where we create and we make open, but we don't actually benefit from the innovation that then comes from those open systems. So those are some of the areas where law and policy can restrict, but can also be used as a tool to enable.
Absolutely. I mean, there are necessary guardrails that must be in place, and those are some of the things that I think that, from your perspective, is certainly the contribution that your center would be able to make. I want to sort of link that to the work that you're doing, and I want you to talk a little bit about, again, the barriers and the challenges that you face in your work, and then the necessary guardrails that you have to put in place as you are working with these language models and with technological developments in order to facilitate multilingualism.
So I think there's quite a few obstacles when dealing with projects like this, and I had a fascinating discussion with someone last week. We talked about business model innovation, and then it connects to something I heard Prof Chijioke say earlier as well. So some of these projects, you'll get organizational resistance, and you'll get resistance either from executive level or your own management level. So there needs to be strategic clarity in terms of what you want to do, but also buy-in. I'm fortunate enough to have an executive that believes in these progressive innovations and stuff that you want to do, which is already one of the hurdles that you can overcome, is that support that you can get in terms of this. Then one of the other barriers in terms of technology is obviously access to infrastructure. So some of these things you can play around with in your office, in your computer there. You can buy yourself a high-end computer with a nice GPU and do some stuff in your office. But when you look to scale some of these initiatives, the infrastructure cost becomes enormous. So you need quite a large investment. And a lot of times, next to the innovation thing, a lot of times people don't want to invest in the infrastructure because they want guaranteed success at the end of the day. And that's not part of the innovation process. You have to fail sometimes to do it. All right. So you struggle sometimes to get that infrastructure costs. However, projects like this by Prof Chijioke and his team is a good example, and it sets the tone for further developments in this. I'm a true believer in, you can actually, by showcasing what you've done, go further. And they've done this work now, so we can actually go further in terms of that. In terms of the guardrails, I think, first of all, organizations need to allow and create space for these things to happen. Whether it is for large language models to be developed in the organizational space or any other form of technology development. This is now AI is the talk, right? There might be something 5 years down the line. How as institutions do we accommodate, whether it's a disruptive technology that comes in from the side, we had no clue about it. How do we accommodate it, incubate it, and then ensure that we can leverage in terms of that? In terms of the large language models and those themselves, in terms of guardrails with regards to biases and those things that can come into the models, the experts from computer science will tell you, you have to be aware of some of the limitations and some of the things that can creep into this. Datasets, datasets contain multiple biases, depending on the dataset you get, but can have multiple biases within them, right? So it's important for people to know that some of these things exist, that can put the guardrails in place to ensure that they don't transfer biases into them. That's just one of the examples. That the data that we have is clean and we can carry on with this. Then lastly, it's incredibly, you mentioned policy. One of the other things that's incredibly difficult with these technologies is to develop policies around them. So we've been trying to develop a policy on AI. And colleagues, the process of an institution. It's the consultation process. It's the different forums that it needs to be. By the time we just said it, everything is outdated. All right. So that's a very, very difficult thing. And now we're just talking about one technology. Right. What about the next thing? Right. I'm just using an example. What about, let's say, blockchain implementation at institution or whatever? So how do you then regulate that into the institution? What type of framework or guidelines or guiding principles are you going to have at the institution instead of, as an example, a policy? Or are you going to have an overarching policy for the different types of technologies that you want to implement? But there does need to be some thought of some microfitting. But you have to regulate some of the different elements in terms of implementing these type of technologies in the institution. Things like data controls and those type of elements. But I think there's ethical things that you can use as well in terms of guidelines within the institution in terms of how you put up the different guardrails for the technologies. Policies will depend on the colleagues from legal in terms of guiding us on that.
Thank you. So I want to wrap this up with a similar question to what we had before with the previous panel, and that is future directions. But I'm going to be maybe a little bit more explicit here. I'll give you some guidance. And the guidance is this. From your perspective and the work that each of you do, so the work in reliable systems and with AI modeling models and in law and policy development, 10 years from now, how do you see things developing? Where do you want to see things developing? What sort of things do you want to have in place around language implementation policy and around the fostering of multilingualism in higher education institutions?
Dreams. I want to start by saying that bias is not necessarily a bad thing. I think that we should, so that's also part of my dream for the future, where we acknowledge bias when we have it and where we see it, and we provide context. Because I start from this because of what you said, about, sometimes the data sets are biased. There is no, in my opinion, there's no human being that is not biased. Everybody is biased. Your biases become a problem when they are arbitrary or they are infringing on fundamental human rights. But I would have a bias for women. I'm a woman. So if I see a competent woman in a space, I would take that competent woman over a man that is competent. But as long as my decision making is guided by competence, then I'm fine. Then it only becomes a thing where I explain. If it's a data set, for example, then you have to provide that context to say, for the past 50 years, this space has been occupied by men, and it's not representative of society because there are also other genders in the society. And so to correct that, we are looking for competent women who can occupy this space. And that's, to me, fine, because you've explained the source of your bias and you've explained how you arrived at your decision making. And I think that should be something that we take forward, because remember what is Brenda said about harmonization, and the fact that it's difficult to harmonize culture. So it then becomes important as we go into these spaces, and that's what I hope to see in the future, that we account for context, that we account for bias without shying away from those things when it might be difficult. And we just then have to explain those contexts. So that's one of my dream for the future. In terms of then law and policy, we have to always, create laws and policies from a place of an understanding of the contextual differences amongst us as African people or as people from this continent. And it's important because we would not have the future that we deserve if we align ourselves with maybe the global north counterparts, because their context is different. So the things that we should consider important is, how do we make sure that our laws are not copycats or copies of what we find outside the continent of Africa, but that our laws are informed and our policies are informed by our context. So for this particular project, we have to, at every point in time, the future that I would like to see is where we are interrogating the mechanisms that we are using to create access to these data sets. Are they equitable? Are they responsive to our context? Are we creating, when we collaborate with other people, how are we ensuring that the rules of engagement in terms of collaboration make sense for everybody? Everything is not about money. Everything is not about funding. There's more to be said about people participating with their full agency and autonomy. And I'll give a quick example in rounding up. There's something that Vugosi sometimes talks about, which is where a situation where you have us here in the continent of Africa be serving as data annotators and data labelers. That's all we're good for. So we come and we provide the translations. We say, this is what this means in Zulu, this is what this means in this language, this is the accurate translation, and our job is done. How about us participating in actually creating those AI tools? Right? So if we are now creating rules of engagement, we should be thinking about, how are we participating equally? So we're not saying we provide the data sets and our job is done. We're saying we want to also be co-creators in the tools that will be made out of these data sets that we are creating today.
All right, so I think I'll let the technologist in me loose in terms of what I see for the future. So So when I talk into the distant future, my hope is, first of all, that you access University of Pretoria website, library website, our institutional repository, our monographs, our digitization, our journal systems, everything. And you select the language that you want. And everything is delivered in the language that you select. And I don't think that is impossible. And this is for our researchers and our students. But what I also want in terms of language for the future of UP is also what people don't see is our staff using it for their everyday usage. Where staff can administer, and I'm using library examples, where staff can administer the institutional repository in their own language, where their work includes their own language. They don't have to work in English. They can work in Sepedi. They can work in Afrikaans. But whatever's read into the system is then obviously made available in the other languages. What I also envisage is that students can come to the library, and I've played around with this a while ago, obviously not for African, South African languages, with a headset and can speak to me in their language and it translates to me and I can understand what they're saying. Or I can attend a virtual class and whatever they're attending, they can listen to their language. And then a little bit further, in terms of sign language, is a metaverse classroom where a student can either have a headset on and attend a lecture and the metaverse character does it in sign language for them. Right, so that is kind of what I see in the future, is that we start integrating this into our daily processes and our operations. It will translate into that output. And then obviously that we can also, from a research perspective, our researchers can publish in their own language. And it's still visible to anybody that wants to access it on an institutional repository, just as an example. So that, for me, would be the ideal, is once we can actually, in everyday parts of our lives, integrate the different solutions that come to the front. I mean, I know from the different perspectives in terms of technologies what's available out there, but it's not made to fit our context. And only we have the power to actually make this fit our context. To translate from an earpiece and, it translates immediately. If someone speaks Italian to me, it shows it to me in English or Afrikaans. I understand what they're saying. So the technology exists, but it's not available for us. Right. So again, it's our responsibility to take that on and to make it available for our countries. And whether it starts as a small little research project in the office, I think that's where it should start, is to play around with these different types of technologies. I always encourage people to go and play around with the different technologies. It's now easier than it used to be to do this stuff. GPT is your friend when you want to go for it. But no, really, I see a future where this is all embedded in our daily way of doing research, teaching, learning, and everything that we try to do in our operations.
All right, thank you all. Thank you both. We're gonna wrap up here, and I think it's a nice way to wrap up this, looking forward into the future, and really letting loose with the idealism and the sort of good ideas that can emerge from here. I think we also have to, as we reflect on everything that's gone before, though, it's interesting to look back. So where were we in 2015? September, October 2015 was Fees Must Fall. And we were reminded of that earlier on. And we have to think about during that, very precipitous time in the history of South African higher education and everything that we took forward from there. Could we look forward and say 10 years from then we were sitting here? Were the goals of that movement realized in the way that what sorts of mistakes? I don't speak specifically about Fees Must Fall. I speak about any period in time, and we're looking forward and we're saying these are the ideals. What are the mistakes that we make in terms of not realizing those ideals? What are the barriers and the challenges, the obstacles that we're not seeing, or that we're not realizing are going to become that much bigger from the time that we go forward? So I encourage you to think about that, to reflect on that, because we know where we want to be. We know the things we want to do, and we all have the goodwill. I never doubt this about people, no matter how long I'm around them, is that there is goodwill in people. We want the best for ourselves and for the world around us and for all of our communities. But things get in the way. How do we stop that from happening? And so we've had a nice roadmap laid out for us here. We have all the foundations in place. What can we do to make this happen? And that's what I encourage you to go away from here.